In the opulent halls of the Royal Alcazar of Madrid on November 6, 1661, Queen Mariana of Austria held in her trembling arms what would become known as the most tragic heir in European history. The infant's deformed features, a grotesquely protruding jaw, vacant stare and pale, sickly complexion, would mark the beginning of the end for one of the most powerful dynasties the world had ever known. This is the horrifying true story of Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king whose very existence became a testament to the devastating consequences of royal inbreeding. The child born that fateful November day was not just physically malformed. He was the living embodiment of 2 centuries of genetic catastrophe. Courtiers whispered in horror as they glimpsed the future king, their faces pale with the realization that the Spanish Empire's fate now rested in the hands of what many privately called a monster. The Queen herself, overcome with a mixture of maternal love and profound terror, knew that she had brought into the world not just her son, but the dynasty's doom. The Spanish Habsburg line had reached its genetic nadir. What began as a strategic marriage policy to consolidate power across Europe had devolved into a nightmarish cycle of genetic degradation. Each generation brought new horrors, new deformities, new signs that nature itself was rebelling against the artificial preservation of bloodlines. Charles II would become the ultimate victim of this centuries-long experiment in human breeding gone catastrophically wrong. The court physicians who examined the newborn prince could barely contain their shock. His head was abnormally large, his limbs weak and malformed, and his tongue hung perpetually from his mouth due to the severe underdevelopment of his jaw. The famous Habsburg jaw, once a distinctive family trait, had become so exaggerated in Charles that he could neither chew solid food nor speak clearly. The very features that had once symbolized royal authority now marked him as nature's victim. Word of the prince's condition spread through the European courts like wildfire, carried by ambassadors and spies who reported back to their monarchs with barely concealed horror. The Spanish Empire, which had dominated global politics for over a century, now faced the terrifying prospect of being ruled by a king who could barely function as a human being. Foreign powers began to circle like vultures, sensing weakness in what had once been an invincible dynasty. The tragedy of Charles II's birth was not an isolated incident, but the inevitable culmination of a family tree that had become a genetic dead end. For generations, the Habsburgs had married their own relatives with increasing frequency, believing that keeping the bloodline pure would preserve their divine right to rule. Instead, they had created a biological catastrophe that would haunt the family for generations and ultimately destroy their empire. Queen Mariana, despite her horror at her son's condition, was determined to protect him from a world that would see him as an abomination. She knew that the future of Spain depended on this damaged child, and she would spend the rest of her life fighting to maintain the fiction that he was capable of ruling an empire. Her maternal devotion would become both a shield for Charles and a tragic obstacle to acknowledging the reality of his limitations. The birth of Charles II marked not just the beginning of one man's tragic life, but the end of an era. The Spanish Golden Age, which had brought art, literature, and empire to unprecedented heights, would crumble under the weight of genetic catastrophe. The child who should have inherited the greatest empire on earth would instead become its unwitting destroyer, a living symbol of the price of power pursued at any cost. To understand the magnitude of this tragedy, we must journey back to the glorious beginnings of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain. The family that would produce this genetic nightmare had once been the most successful royal house in European history. Their story begins with calculated ambition and strategic brilliance, making their eventual downfall all the more devastating and complete. The Habsburg dynasty's rise to power in Spain began in 1516, when Charles I and later Holy Roman Emperor Charles V inherited the Spanish throne from his maternal grandfather, Ferdinand of Aragon. This was the beginning of what historians would call the Spanish Golden Age, a period of unprecedented expansion, wealth, and cultural achievement. The young emperor ruled over an empire where, it was said, the sun never set. Charles V was everything his distant descendant would not be: intelligent, physically imposing, and politically astute. Under his rule, Spanish conquistadors carved out vast empires in the Americas, bringing unimaginable wealth in gold and silver back to Europe. The Spanish court became the most powerful in Europe, setting fashion, art, and political trends that other nations scrambled to follow. The emperor's son, Philip II, continued this tradition of strength and expansion. Philip ruled from the magnificent Escorial Palace, a massive complex that symbolized Spanish power and Catholic orthodoxy. During his reign, Spain's territories included much of Italy, the Netherlands, parts of France, vast swaths of the Americas, and even the Philippines. The Spanish Armada, though ultimately defeated by the English, represented the height of Spanish naval power. However, even in these golden years, the seeds of future disaster were being planted. The Habsburgs had begun their practice of marrying within the family to keep their vast territories unified under a single bloodline. Philip II married his niece Mary I of England and later his own cousin Anna of Austria. These marriages seemed politically brilliant at the time, consolidating power and preventing the division of the empire. The wealth flowing from the Americas created an illusion of invincibility that masked growing problems within the Habsburg family structure. Spanish nobles lived in unprecedented luxury, building magnificent palaces and patronizing artists like El Greco and Velázquez. The court became a center of artistic achievement that rivaled Renaissance Italy, but beneath this cultural flowering lay a genetic time bomb. Philip II's son, Philip III, began to show the first serious signs of Habsburg genetic deterioration. While not as severely affected as later generations would be, he displayed the family's increasing tendency toward mental instability and physical weakness. His reign marked the beginning of Spain's slow decline, though few recognized it at the time. The empire was still vast and wealthy enough to hide its growing internal problems. The practice of royal intermarriage was not unique to the Habsburgs, but they pursued it with an obsessive determination that surpassed all other European dynasties. Each generation saw uncles marrying nieces, cousins wed to cousins, and strategic alliances that prioritized bloodline purity over genetic health. The family tree began to resemble a tangled web rather than a branching structure. As the 17th century dawned, the Spanish Habsburgs stood at the pinnacle of world power, unaware that their very success contained the seeds of their destruction. The genetic damage accumulating in their bloodline would soon manifest in ways that would shock the world and ultimately bring down the greatest empire in human history. The stage was set for the birth of Charles II, the final tragic product of this centuries-long genetic experiment. Philip III's reign revealed the first serious cracks in the Habsburg facade of invincibility. Unlike his predecessors, Philip showed little interest in governing, preferring to delegate authority to his favorites while he pursued hunting and religious devotion. This marked a dangerous shift from the hands-on leadership style that had built the Spanish Empire to a more passive approach that would characterize later Habsburg rulers. The king's physical appearance began to show more pronounced signs of the family's genetic problems. The Habsburg jaw was becoming more prominent with each generation, and Philip III suffered from various health issues that contemporary court physicians could not explain. His inability to focus on affairs of state for extended periods suggested cognitive difficulties that would become increasingly common in the family line. During Philip III's reign, Spain began its first serious military and economic setbacks. The Dutch revolt continued to drain Spanish resources, while the 30 Years' War further stretched the empire's finances and military capacity. The endless flow of gold and silver from the Americas had created inflation throughout Europe and made Spain dependent on resources it could not control indefinitely. The king's marriage to Margaret of Austria, his own cousin, produced several children, but many died in infancy or childhood, a pattern that would become increasingly common as the genetic damage accumulated. Those who survived often showed signs of physical or mental impairment that court officials carefully concealed from foreign observers and the general public. Court life during Philip III's reign became increasingly ceremonial and disconnected from the realities of governing a vast empire. The elaborate etiquette of the Spanish court, once a symbol of sophisticated power, began to serve as a mechanism for hiding the royal family's growing inadequacies. Courtiers developed intricate protocols that allowed kings to appear dignified while minimizing their actual participation in decision-making. The Spanish Inquisition, originally established to maintain religious orthodoxy, increasingly became a tool for suppressing any discussion of the royal family's problems. Anyone who dared to suggest that the king's difficulties were hereditary or questioned the wisdom of royal intermarriage faced potential charges of heresy or treason. This created a climate of enforced ignorance that prevented any rational response to the dynasty's growing crisis. Foreign ambassadors began reporting back to their home countries about the strange behavior and appearance of the Spanish royal family, but these reports were often dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. The wealth and military power of Spain were still formidable enough to command respect, even as those who observed the court closely began to suspect that something was seriously wrong. As Philip III's reign progressed, the pattern of decline that would culminate in Charles II became increasingly evident. Each royal birth was watched with anxiety by courtiers who had learned to fear what genetic surprises each new generation might bring. The dynasty that had once seemed blessed by God was beginning to appear cursed by nature itself. The reign of Philip IV marked the point of no return for the Habsburg genetic catastrophe. Born in 1605, Philip showed more severe manifestations of the family's hereditary problems than any previous Spanish king. His famous portraits by Diego Velázquez carefully concealed the full extent of his deformities, but court records and contemporary accounts reveal a man struggling with significant physical and mental limitations. Philip IV's marriage to his niece, Mariana of Austria, represented the dynasty's most catastrophic genetic decision. The couple were so closely related that their marriage amounted to biological suicide for their potential offspring. Court genealogists, if they had been honest, could have predicted the disasters that would result from this union, but political considerations overrode any concern for genetic health. The king's inability to produce a healthy male heir became one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Spanish court. Multiple pregnancies ended in miscarriage, stillbirth, or the deaths of infants who showed severe deformities. The few children who survived past infancy often displayed obvious signs of genetic damage that horrified even the hardened courtiers who had grown accustomed to Habsburg peculiarities. Philip IV's own health deteriorated rapidly as he aged, and his mental capacity became increasingly questionable. Foreign ambassadors reported that the king often seemed confused during meetings and appeared to have difficulty understanding complex political situations. His famous melancholy, immortalized in Velázquez's paintings, may have been as much a result of genetic depression as the burdens of rulership. The Spanish Empire during Philip IV's reign began its irreversible decline. The loss of Portugal, military defeats in Europe, and economic crisis all reflected the reality that Spain was now being governed by a man whose genetic inheritance made effective leadership impossible. The bureaucracy that had once efficiently administered a global empire became increasingly chaotic and corrupt. Queen Mariana's multiple miscarriages and the deaths of her children became sources of superstitious terror throughout the Spanish court. Courtiers whispered that the royal family was cursed, and some began to openly question whether God had withdrawn his favor from the Habsburg dynasty. These whispers, though dangerous to voice publicly, reflected a growing awareness that something was fundamentally wrong. The birth of Margarita Teresa in 1651 provided temporary hope, as she appeared relatively normal at birth. However, her subsequent betrothal to her uncle, Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, ensured that the cycle of inbreeding would continue into the next generation. The Habsburg commitment to genetic suicide seemed unshakable, even in the face of mounting evidence of its consequences. When Prince Philip Prospero was born in 1657, court physicians initially celebrated what appeared to be a healthy male heir. However, the prince's health quickly deteriorated and he died at the age of 4, leaving the succession once again in doubt. His death intensified the desperation surrounding Queen Mariana's subsequent pregnancies and set the stage for the tragic birth of Charles II. The pregnancy that would produce Charles II was marked by ominous signs that terrified the superstitious Spanish court. Queen Mariana, now in her 20s but already worn down by multiple failed pregnancies and the death of her young son, experienced complications that court physicians had never encountered before. Her condition seemed to worsen with each passing month, as if her body was rejecting the child she carried. Contemporary accounts described the Queen's pregnancy as unusually difficult, with symptoms that suggested the fetus was developing abnormally. Court physicians, bound by royal protocol and their own limited medical knowledge, could only watch helplessly as Mariana endured what appeared to be an increasingly dangerous pregnancy. The Queen's own terror was palpable to those around her, as she seemed to sense that this birth would be different from her previous tragedies. The royal chambers were prepared with unusual secrecy and security as the due date approached. King Philip IV, already showing signs of the mental deterioration that would characterize his final years, insisted on elaborate religious ceremonies and prayers for a successful birth. The entire Spanish Empire held its breath, knowing that the future of the dynasty depended on the successful delivery of a healthy male heir. As labor began, Queen Mariana's screams echoed through the royal apartments with an intensity that terrified even the experienced midwives and physicians in attendance. Court records, though carefully censored, suggest that the birth was unusually traumatic and prolonged. The Queen's obvious distress was amplified by her apparent premonition that something was seriously wrong with her child. The moment of birth, on November 6, 1661, brought not celebration, but horror to the Spanish court. The infant that emerged was so obviously deformed that the attending physicians initially considered whether it could survive at all. The famous Habsburg jaw had reached such an extreme that the child's mouth could not close properly, and his tongue protruded in a way that made normal feeding impossible. Queen Mariana's first glimpse of her son reportedly caused her to faint, though court records diplomatically described this as exhaustion from the difficult birth. The carefully orchestrated celebration that had been planned for the arrival of the heir was hastily cancelled, and only the most trusted courtiers were allowed to see the newborn prince. The secret of Charles's condition became one of the most closely guarded state secrets in European history. The infant's survival through his first days surprised everyone in the royal household. Court physicians, working with primitive medical knowledge and superstitious beliefs, could not explain how such a severely damaged child could continue to live. Some saw divine intervention, while others whispered about supernatural forces that were keeping the prince alive for some terrible purpose. The immediate challenge facing the court was how to announce the birth to the Spanish people and foreign governments without revealing the full extent of the prince's deformities. Elaborate protocols were developed to limit access to the infant, and official portraits were carefully crafted to minimize the appearance of his genetic damage. The fiction that Spain had a healthy heir would be maintained for years, even as those closest to the royal family knew the devastating truth. The early years of Charles II's life were marked by constant medical crises that kept the Spanish court in a perpetual state of anxiety. The infant could not nurse properly due to his severely malformed jaw and palate, requiring specially designed feeding apparatus that had to be constantly adjusted as he grew. Court physicians, working with medieval medical knowledge, could only guess at treatments for conditions they had never encountered before. Charles's developmental delays became apparent within months of his birth. While normal infants began to show signs of awareness and responsiveness, the future king remained largely passive and unresponsive to stimuli. His large, vacant eyes would stare without focus, and he showed none of the normal reflexes that physicians expected from healthy babies. The Queen's desperate attempts to stimulate her son's development only highlighted his profound limitations. Walking proved to be another insurmountable challenge for the young prince. His weak, malformed limbs could not support his disproportionately large head, and he remained unable to stand without assistance well into childhood. When he finally did achieve a form of locomotion, it was an awkward, stumbling gait that required constant supervision to prevent falls and injuries. Speech development was perhaps the most tragic aspect of Charles's early years. His grotesquely enlarged tongue and malformed jaw made normal speech impossible, and the sounds he produced were often unintelligible even to those who spent their lives caring for him. Queen Mariana spent hours each day attempting to teach her son basic words, but progress was minimal and heartbreaking. The psychological impact on Queen Mariana was devastating. She had entered motherhood with high hopes of producing the heir who would continue the Habsburg dynasty, only to find herself caring for a child whose condition made normal development impossible. Her letters from this period, preserved in Spanish archives, reveal a woman struggling with profound grief and guilt over her son's condition. Court life adapted around Charles's limitations with an elaborate system of protocols designed to hide his condition from outsiders. Special tutors were brought in to work with the prince, though their efforts met with limited success. The normal education expected for a future king had to be abandoned in favor of basic survival skills and rudimentary communication. King Philip IV's reaction to his son's condition reflected the complex mixture of denial and despair that characterized the court's response to Charles's birth. The aging king continued to insist publicly that his heir was developing normally, while privately seeking increasingly desperate medical and spiritual interventions. Court physicians were under enormous pressure to find treatments for conditions that were essentially untreatable. The secrecy surrounding Charles's condition created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion throughout the Spanish court. Servants and courtiers who had direct contact with the prince were sworn to secrecy under pain of death, while elaborate ruses were developed to maintain the fiction of his normal development for foreign ambassadors and visiting dignitaries. As Charles II reached what should have been the age of formal education, the full scope of the challenge facing the Spanish monarchy became undeniable. The heir to the greatest empire in the world was intellectually and physically incapable of learning even the most basic skills required for survival, let alone the complex art of statecraft. The dynasty that had ruled half the world was now represented by a child who could barely function as a human being. The death of Philip IV in 1665 thrust the 4-year-old Charles II onto the throne of Spain, creating a constitutional crisis that exposed the full extent of the Habsburg genetic catastrophe. The regency established under Queen Mariana's authority faced the impossible task of governing a global empire while concealing the fact that their king was incapable of even the most basic royal functions. Contemporary accounts of Charles's coronation describe a deeply disturbing scene carefully choreographed to hide the young king's condition. The crown had to be specially fitted to accommodate his abnormally large head, and he required constant physical support throughout the ceremony. His inability to speak the required oaths meant that others had to speak for him, creating constitutional questions about the legitimacy of his reign. Foreign ambassadors who were granted audiences with the child king returned to their home countries with shocking reports about the Spanish royal family. The French ambassador described Charles as more animal than human, while the English representative wrote that the king appeared to be afflicted with an obvious madness that renders him unfit for any royal duty. These reports circulated through European courts, undermining Spanish diplomatic credibility. The Regency government faced constant challenges in conducting day-to-day administration, while maintaining the fiction that Charles was capable of ruling. Official documents required the king's signature, leading to the development of elaborate mechanisms for guiding his hand to make marks that could pass for royal approval. The entire governmental system became an exercise in maintaining a fraudulent charade. Military defeats during Charles's early reign reflected the reality that Spain was now effectively leaderless. The War of Devolution against France resulted in significant territorial losses, while rebellions in Sicily and other territories went largely unchecked. Foreign powers began to recognize that Spanish weakness presented unprecedented opportunities for territorial expansion and political advantage. The Spanish economy, already strained by decades of war and inflation, faced additional pressures from the governmental chaos created by Charles's incapacity. Trade routes became less secure, colonial administration grew increasingly corrupt, and the once mighty Spanish navy began to decline rapidly. The empire that had dominated global commerce for over a century was coming apart at the seams. Religious authorities throughout Spain began to question whether Charles's condition represented divine punishment for the sins of the Habsburg dynasty. The Spanish Inquisition, while officially supporting the monarchy, privately investigated allegations of supernatural causes for the king's affliction. Some religious leaders suggested that the royal family had been cursed for their excessive pride and departure from God's will. Queen Mariana's regency became increasingly desperate as Charles failed to show any signs of improvement with age. Court physicians exhausted every medical treatment known to 17th century science, while spiritual advisors organized elaborate ceremonies and pilgrimages seeking divine intervention. The Queen's personal agony was compounded by her responsibility for maintaining royal authority while knowing that her son could never truly rule. The broader Spanish nobility began to fragment into competing factions, as it became clear that Charles would never produce an heir of his own. Succession planning became a constant source of court intrigue, with various noble families positioning themselves for the eventual end of the Habsburg line. The unity that had characterized Spanish aristocracy during the empire's golden age gave way to destructive internal competition. As Charles II grew older, his condition became increasingly difficult to hide from the Spanish people themselves. Rumors about the king's divine affliction spread throughout the empire, creating social unrest and challenging the legitimacy of royal authority. The mystique of divine kingship that had supported Habsburg rule for generations began to crumble under the weight of obvious royal inadequacy. The teenage years of Charles II brought new horrors as his genetic conditions worsened with physical maturity. What court physicians had hoped might be childhood developmental delays proved to be permanent and progressive deterioration. His already severe physical deformities became more pronounced, while his mental capacity showed no signs of improvement despite years of intensive educational efforts. Charles's eating difficulties, which had plagued him since infancy, became life-threatening as he grew larger. His malformed jaw and enlarged tongue made chewing impossible, forcing him to subsist on liquid diets that provided inadequate nutrition. Court physicians watched helplessly as the King of Spain slowly starved, despite having access to the finest foods in Europe. The king's attempts at communication remained largely unsuccessful throughout his adolescence. While he could make sounds that those familiar with him could sometimes interpret, he never developed anything approaching normal speech. Royal proclamations and official communications had to be entirely fabricated by his regents, creating legal questions about the validity of his reign that Spanish jurists carefully avoided addressing. Sexual maturity brought the court face to face with the most pressing dynastic question: whether Charles would ever be capable of producing an heir. Court physicians' examinations revealed severe anatomical problems that made reproduction highly unlikely, but this information was treated as the most sensitive state secret. The future of the Spanish Empire depended on maintaining hope for a miraculous royal pregnancy. Charles's first marriage, arranged to Marie-Louise of Orléans in 1679, represented a desperate attempt to continue the Habsburg line. The French princess, described by contemporaries as beautiful and vivacious, arrived at the Spanish court unprepared for the reality of her husband's condition. Her shock and revulsion were carefully concealed by court protocol, but her private letters reveal her horror at the situation. The wedding ceremony itself became an exercise in elaborate deception, with Charles requiring constant assistance to complete even the most basic ritual requirements. Court officials had to guide his movements throughout the service, while his inability to speak the marriage vows clearly raised questions about the validity of the union. The celebration that followed was marked by the conspicuous absence of the royal couple, who were quickly whisked away from public view. Marie-Louise's attempts to establish a normal marital relationship with Charles proved impossible due to his severe physical and mental limitations. Contemporary accounts suggest that consummation of the marriage was probably impossible, though court physicians continued to insist publicly that the royal couple was actively trying to produce an heir. The Queen's increasing desperation and depression became evident to all who observed her. The failure to produce a royal heir after several years of marriage created a succession crisis that dominated Spanish politics. Foreign powers began making plans for the eventual partition of the Spanish Empire, while domestic factions competed for influence in anticipation of Charles's death without issue. The Habsburg dynasty, that had once seemed divinely blessed, was now obviously cursed with biological extinction. Marie-Louise's mysterious death in 1689 was accompanied by rumors of poisoning, though modern historians generally attribute it to natural causes exacerbated by the stress of her impossible marriage. Her death removed any remaining hope that Charles might produce a direct heir, forcing the Spanish court to confront the reality that the Habsburg line would end with him. The search for a second wife for Charles II represented the final desperate attempt to continue the Habsburg dynasty. The choice of Mariana of Neuburg, daughter of the Elector Palatine, reflected political considerations rather than any realistic hope for successful reproduction. Contemporary observers noted that the bride appeared resigned to a marriage that everyone understood would be largely ceremonial. Charles's second marriage in 1690 followed the same pattern of elaborate public ceremony concealing private dysfunction. By this time, the king's condition had deteriorated further, and he required even more assistance to participate in the wedding ritual. Foreign diplomats attending the ceremony reported back to their governments with barely concealed amazement at the spectacle of a clearly incompetent man being married to continue a royal line. The new queen's attempts to fulfill her dynastic duty proved as fruitless as those of her predecessor. Charles's physical condition had worsened to the point where even the pretense of a functioning marriage became difficult to maintain. Court physicians continued their charade of monitoring the royal couple for signs of pregnancy, but everyone involved understood that such hopes were futile. Mariana of Neuburg's letters from this period reveal her growing frustration and despair, at her husband's condition and the impossible expectations placed upon her. She wrote privately about Charles's infantile behavior, his inability to understand even simple concepts, and his increasingly frequent episodes of what appeared to be seizures or other neurological events. The Spanish court's elaborate efforts to maintain the fiction of a functioning royal marriage became increasingly desperate and absurd. Official announcements about the royal couple's health and activities bore no resemblance to reality, while foreign ambassadors' reports painted a picture of a monarchy that had descended into pure theatre with no substance behind the performance. As Charles entered his 30s without producing an heir, the question of Spanish succession became the dominant issue in European diplomacy. The major powers began negotiating partition treaties that would divide the Spanish Empire among themselves, treating Charles as if he were already dead. The king, who should have been at the height of his power, had become irrelevant to decisions about his own kingdom's future. The final decade of Charles II's reign witnessed the complete collapse of Spanish power and prestige. Military defeats accumulated as enemy forces recognized that Spain was led by a king incapable of strategic thinking or effective command. The War of the League of Augsburg saw Spanish territories repeatedly overrun by better organized opponents who understood that they faced no real resistance from the nominal Spanish leadership. Charles's physical deterioration accelerated dramatically during his final years. Court physicians documented a horrifying progression of symptoms that included increasing seizures, apparent paralysis of his limbs, and periods of complete unconsciousness that lasted for days. The Habsburg genetic inheritance that had been accumulating damage for generations finally overwhelmed his body's ability to function. The king's mental state, already severely compromised, deteriorated into what can only be described as complete intellectual collapse. Contemporary accounts describe a man who could no longer recognize familiar faces, respond to his own name, or perform any of the basic functions of daily life without constant assistance. The ruler of the world's largest empire had become utterly dependent on others for survival. Foreign diplomats who managed to observe Charles during this period reported scenes that shocked even hardened political observers. The French ambassador wrote of seeing the king drooling uncontrollably while being fed like an infant, unable to understand where he was or why people were gathered around him. These reports circulated through European courts as evidence of Spanish weakness and divine judgment. The Spanish court's attempts to conceal Charles's condition became increasingly futile, as his symptoms could no longer be hidden even during brief public appearances. Official portraits from this period show a man whose genetic damage had become so severe that artistic skill could no longer disguise his deformities. The Habsburg jaw had grown so pronounced that his face barely looked human. Religious authorities throughout Spain began openly discussing whether Charles's condition represented punishment for dynastic sins. The Spanish Inquisition, while still officially loyal to the crown, privately investigated claims that the royal family had been cursed for their defiance of natural law through excessive inbreeding. Some religious leaders suggested that God had withdrawn his blessing from the Habsburg line. The question of Charles's testament became crucial as European powers positioned themselves for the partition of the Spanish Empire. The king's obvious inability to understand complex political issues meant that his final will would be entirely the product of competing court factions rather than any royal decision. The document that would determine the fate of half the world would be written by a man who could not read it. Economic collapse accompanied political disintegration as Spain's colonial empire began to function independently of royal authority. Trade routes that had enriched Europe for over a century started to break down as colonial administrators lost confidence in orders from Madrid. The wealth that had sustained Habsburg power for generations dried up just when it was most desperately needed. The Spanish nobility's preparation for the end of the Habsburg dynasty created internal conflicts that further weakened royal authority. Noble families that had served the crown for generations began making separate arrangements with foreign powers, recognizing that Charles's death would bring dramatic changes to the Spanish political system. Loyalty to the crown became increasingly meaningless when the crown itself had lost all real power. As Charles II lay dying in the royal Alcazar of Madrid in November 1700, the scene represented one of history's most profound dynastic tragedies. The man who had inherited the greatest empire in human history was departing life, having accomplished nothing except the destruction of his family's genetic line. Court physicians who had spent decades treating his impossible condition could only watch as nature finally claimed its victim. The king's final days were marked by symptoms that contemporary observers found deeply disturbing. His body, ravaged by generations of genetic damage, began shutting down in ways that medieval medicine could not understand or treat. Court records describe seizures that lasted for hours, periods of apparent death followed by unexpected revival, and physical deterioration that horrified even those accustomed to his condition. Charles's inability to communicate his final wishes meant that competing court factions fought over his deathbed, each claiming to represent the dying king's intentions. The testament that would determine the Spanish succession was written and rewritten multiple times as different groups gained temporary influence over the dying monarch. European powers waited anxiously for news of his death and the revelation of his final will. The elaborate religious ceremonies surrounding Charles's death reflected both genuine spiritual concern and political theater. Spanish clergy performed elaborate last rites for a king who appeared unable to understand their significance, while court officials ensured that the proper protocols were followed to maintain the legitimacy of whatever succession arrangements emerged from his testament. Queen Mariana of Neuburg's vigil at her husband's bedside represented the final act of a marriage that had never been more than political theater. Her private writings from this period reveal relief mixed with genuine sadness for a man whose life had been ruined by circumstances beyond his control. She had witnessed firsthand the destruction wrought by centuries of Habsburg genetic policy. Foreign ambassadors who gained access to the royal deathbed reported scenes that stunned European courts. The dying King of Spain, they wrote, looked more like a corpse that had been artificially animated than a living human being. His breathing was labored and irregular. His eyes had lost all focus, and his famous Habsburg jaw had become so distorted that his face was barely recognizable as human. The moment of Charles's death on November 1st, 1700, marked not just the end of one man's tragic life, but the conclusion of Spanish dominance in European politics. The empire that had shaped global history for over 2 centuries would now be carved up among foreign powers, its vast territories redistributed according to the military strength of its rivals rather than the wishes of its former rulers. News of the king's death spread rapidly through Madrid and then across Europe, carried by a network of spies and diplomats who had been waiting for this moment for years. In Vienna, Paris, and London, government ministers began implementing plans that had been developed in anticipation of the Spanish succession crisis. The death of one genetically damaged man would reshape the balance of European power. The final irony of Charles II's death was that his testament, naming Philip of Anjou as his successor, ensured that the Spanish throne would pass to the French Bourbon dynasty, the very family that Spanish Habsburgs had fought for generations. The genetic catastrophe that ended the Habsburg line also delivered Spain's empire to their traditional enemies, completing the circle of dynastic destruction. The aftermath of Charles II's death revealed the full extent of the damage inflicted by 2 centuries of Habsburg inbreeding. Spain, once the dominant global power, became a secondary player in European politics almost overnight. The empire's vast American territories gradually gained independence, while European possessions were traded among the great powers like commercial commodities. The War of Spanish Succession that followed Charles's death consumed Europe for over a decade as major powers fought to determine who would inherit the vast Spanish Empire. The conflict that emerged from his death toll in human and economic terms far exceeded anything Charles himself could have imagined, making his genetic tragedy a catalyst for some of the bloodiest warfare in European history. Modern genetic analysis of the Habsburg family tree reveals the full scientific horror of what contemporary observers could only describe in superstitious terms. The coefficient of inbreeding in Charles II's lineage exceeded that found in laboratory mice bred specifically for genetic research, making his survival to age 39 a biological miracle that defied medical understanding. The Spanish territories that once formed the world's largest empire were ultimately partitioned among the great powers of Europe, with France gaining effective control over Spain itself, while Austria received portions of Italy and the Low Countries. The British Empire expanded into former Spanish territories, while Portuguese and Dutch colonial empires filled gaps left by Spanish retreat. The cultural and artistic treasures accumulated during the Spanish Golden Age were scattered across Europe as the empire disintegrated. Paintings by Velázquez and El Greco, literary works by Cervantes and Lope de Vega, and architectural marvels like the Escorial became monuments to a civilization that had destroyed itself through genetic catastrophe rather than military defeat. The Spanish Inquisition, which had once enforced religious orthodoxy across half the world, quietly disbanded many of its operations as the political power that sustained it evaporated. The institution that had burned heretics and suppressed dissent for centuries found itself powerless to prevent the dynastic collapse it had failed to recognize or address. The tragedy of Charles II's life extended beyond his personal suffering to encompass the millions of people whose lives were disrupted by the collapse of Spanish power. Colonial populations in the Americas faced decades of warfare and political instability, while European communities that had depended on Spanish trade and protection found themselves abandoned to more aggressive neighbors. The scientific lessons of the Habsburg genetic catastrophe would not be understood for centuries, as the mechanisms of heredity remain mysterious until the development of modern genetics. The family that had inadvertently conducted one of history's most extensive experiments in human inbreeding left behind a legacy that would inform genetic research for generations to come. The final assessment of Charles II's reign must acknowledge both the personal tragedy of his impossible life and the broader historical consequences of his genetic inheritance. A man who should have been one of history's most powerful monarchs instead became a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing political expedience over biological reality. The Spanish Empire's Golden Age, which had lasted for over 2 centuries and reshaped global history, came to an end not through military defeat or economic collapse, but through the slow-motion genetic suicide of its ruling dynasty. The Habsburgs had conquered continents and accumulated vast wealth, only to destroy themselves through their obsessive pursuit of bloodline purity. The empty throne rooms and abandoned palaces of the Spanish court became monuments to dynastic hubris and the terrible price of ignoring natural law. The royal Alcazar, where Charles II had lived and died, stood as a testament to the truth that even the greatest human achievements cannot overcome the fundamental biological requirements for genetic diversity and health. The story of Charles II serves as a permanent reminder that political power, no matter how vast or seemingly permanent, cannot protect those who violate the basic principles of genetic health. The dynasty that had ruled half the world learned too late that some forms of wealth and power come at prices that even emperors cannot afford to pay. In the end, the queen who gave birth to a monster had actually delivered the inevitable product of generations of genetic catastrophe. Charles II was not an aberration, but the logical conclusion of a family tree that had become a biological dead end. His tragic life stands as one of history's most powerful examples of how human ambition and political calculation can lead to consequences that destroy the very thing they sought to preserve.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.